Hi there, and welcome to Vodcast number 3. Is it 3?
It's vodcast number 3 for week number 4. That's right, isn't it? So we didn't have a vodcast for the first week. So this is about. Oh no, I've forgotten so what do I do now?
You just
Might minimise that
and
and
then
maximise that.
exactly.
See, I can't hold information in my head from one week to the next. So biology and politics, Darwin's Afterlives. So this is the moment at which we draw out some of the threads from the conversations that have been haunting the workshops in the first few weeks and look at some of the ways in which Darwin's theory, which is after all a biological theory, has been extremely influential in the wider fields of politics, cultural criticism, the arts, etc. And here is our usual sketch of where we're going to go with this. So we're framing this as a tension between two thinkers, who I'll say more about in a moment, who have very different responses to Darwin's views, so Peter Kropotkin and Francis Galton. To think properly about this contrast between Kropotkin and Galton, we need to dig back a little bit more into some of the writers that are very important in relation to Darwin. Thomas Malthus, who we've mentioned before, and Herbert Spencer, we've also mentioned before. I'm going to talk a bit about the idea of the animal as a transcendental singular, with reference briefly to Jacques Derrida, who we've also talked about. Then we move on to myrmecology, the study of ants, before talking a bit about the dark territory of eugenics in relation to degeneration theory, one of the key contexts for the development of eugenics, and ideas of genocide, and theorising that at the end by returning to the idea of biopolitics. So that is what is going to happen. And here, Peter Kropotkin and Francis Galton. So Kropotkin, rather a kindly face, beard like a privet hedge, somewhat Marxist kind of a beard, and Francis Galton there looking somewhat like a curmudgeonly turtle. So Kropotkin as a Russian political theorist, interpreter of Darwin, and I suppose he is most commonly associated with anarchism. So we might think reductively now of anarchism as a kind of nihilism associated with people smashing stuff up. But anarchism has a far longer lineage than that. It's a very interesting and very noble political philosophy, a pacifist philosophy in many of its guises. Kropotkin, one of the most influential formulators of anarchism, the late 19th and early 20th century. Galton, we associate with eugenics, a cousin of Darwin's, a founder of various statistical methodologies, and someone who was really significant in the Third Reich, in the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s. So the political left and the political right, two ways of thinking about or developing Darwin's thought into the world of human politics. So what we're doing, talking about this in English studies, this is kind of critical theory, basically theories of ideas which are based on rhetoric, uses of language, discourses. So that is, I suppose, one way of thinking about the module as a whole, if you're trying to work out what we're doing in the School of English talking about this kind of stuff. So, Thomas Malthus, Mutual Aid, which is the text from Kropotkin, we're looking at excerpts from in week 4, critiques Malthus. So we need to do a little bit of Malthusian analysis to work out what's going on with this. So for Kropotkin, Malthus's writing is far too narrow. It's a narrow Malthusian conception of competition between each and all. And as we've already seen, this is really important, very influential in how Darwin comes to conceive of the origin of species. So the conception of competition between each and all is the struggle for existence that Darwin formulates right at the start of the origin of species. But to put a bit more depth into this context, two quotations from Malthus, writing right at the end of the 18th century, that illustrate an assumption of an implicit, inherent violence in human society, which is part of this struggle for existence that Darwin formulates. So this is a moment when Malthus is writing about what we might call, for the sake of argument, primitive culture. So looking back into pre or early history about how human civilizations are formed. And these are the kinds of assumptions that Malthus makes here. So he's writing about savage contests in which many tribes must have been utterly exterminated. Some probably perished by hardship and famine. Others, whose leading star had given them a happier direction, became great and powerful tribes, and in their turns sent off fresh adventurers in search of still more fertile seats. The prodigious waste of human life occasioned by this perpetual struggle for room and food was more than supplied by the mighty power of population. The tribes that migrated towards the south, though they won these more fruitful regions by continual battles, rapidly increased in number and power from the increased means of subsistence, till at length the whole territory, from the confines of China to the shores of the Baltic, was peopled by a various race of barbarians, brave, robust, and enterprising, inured to hardship and delighting in war. I'm tempted to say this is the Conservative Party manifesto. So the idea of enterprise that is still so prevalent in 21st century debates is haunted, I would say, by this Malthusian science, in inverted commas, of population. So humanity, civilization and violence are indistinguishable and inevitably connected in Malthus's view. Benevolence, he goes on to write, yet lingering in a few bosoms, makes some faint expiring struggles, till at length self-love resumes his wonted empire, and lords it triumphant over the world. So the science of population is the legitimation of an ideology of self-love, which is held to be what we might think of now as genetically predetermined, that there is no way beyond this biological inheritance of self-interest and the forms of violence that it inevitably gives rise to. Herbert Spencer, much later, but and a contemporary of Darwin, is very closely related to this idea as well. The survival of fittest, a term erroneously often attributed to Darwin, is Herbert Spencer's way of glossing this, and this is what he gives most notably to Darwinist theory. This survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is what Mr. Darwin has called natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. That there is going on a process of this kind throughout the organic world. Mr. Darwin's great work on the origin of species has shown to the satisfaction of nearly all naturalists. So there's two levels of discussion going on in Spencer's work on the survival of the fittest here. The reminder that Darwin is a naturalist who's concerned with the organic world, but the implication that this is somehow applicable to the human as well. So the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. So favoured races in the 19th century has a clear colonial ramification as well. So thinking about the natural world and thinking about human history are unavoidably associated in the responses to Darwin's thought. Kropotkin not happy with this. So Kropotkin finds this very problematic, the way in which discourses of the natural, discourses of the animal are translated straightforwardly, unproblematically, as the basis of human politics. So he writes, and while Herbert Spencer, starting on independent but closely allied lines, attempted to widen the inquiry into that great question, who are the fittest, especially in the appendix to the third edition of the Data of Ethics, the numberless followers of Darwin reduced the notion of struggle for existence to its narrowest limits. They came to conceive the animal world as a world of perpetual struggle among half-starved individuals, thirsting for one another's blood. So it's important to note that Kropotkin does not oppose or resist Darwinist theory. He's very much a Darwinian. Where he differs from people like Herbert Spencer is in the presumptions about how this might be translated into human politics. So for Kropotkin, Herbert Spencer's idea of the survival of the fittest being applied to humanity is a reduction of Darwinist theories. It's a reductive view of Darwinist theory. I also wanted to highlight the idea of the Data of Ethics, Spencer's text that Kropotkin draws on here. Can ethics and data work seamlessly together? Ponder that yourselves. So one of the problems that Kropotkin finds, in finding this problem, he anticipates some of the later work of Jacques Derrida related to the idea of the animal world, that there is this one thing called the animal world that we understand to be somehow internally consistent and coherent. Derrida thinks this is madness. And of course it is. So in his late, very beautiful essay, The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida engages with this idea of the animal rather than animals. Confined within this catch-all concept, within this vast encampment of the animal, in this general singular, within the strict enclosure of this definite article, the animal and not animals, as in a virgin forest, a zoo, a hunting or fishing ground, a paddock or an abattoir, all spaces of violence, a space of domestication, are all the living things that man does not recognise as his fellows, his neighbours or his brothers. And that is so in spite of the infinite space that separates the lizard from the dog, the protozoan from the dolphin, the shark from the lamb, the parrot from the chimpanzee, the camel from the eagle, the squirrel from the tiger, or the elephant from the cat, the ant from the silkworm, or the hedgehog from the echidna. Derrida, of course, is very complex in a lot of his work, but this is actually an extremely simple and self-evident point, that though we may think of the protozoan and the dolphin as both being animals, they're extremely diverse forms of life. So the idea of the animal as a straightforward opposition to the human is obviously a kind of madness, really. Animal contains within it an enormous variety of differences, which is what Derrida is perhaps most of all concerned with in that essay. So there are issues with how we go about translating the animal to the human, how we go about developing paradigms for human political conduct based on animal conduct. And it all depends what animal you choose. So you could base a human politics on tigers, or you could base a human politics on ants. And this is something that Kropotkin suggests might be one way of having an evolutionary politics that isn't Malthusian, isn't Spencerian, and isn't always about violence and the sacrificing the weak to the needs of the strong. And this is what he writes about ants in Mutual Aid. And if the ant, apart from the still higher developed termites, stands at the very top of the whole class of insects for its intellectual capacities, if its courage is only equalled by the most courageous vertebrates, and if its brain, to use Darwin's words, is one of the most marvellous atoms of matter in the world, perhaps more so than the brain of man, is it not due to the fact that mutual aid has entirely taken the place of mutual struggle in the communities of ants? Ants are important in Kropotkin and elsewhere in evolutionary thinking precisely because they provide this remarkable example of communitarian existence, working together for a common end. And there's some really remarkable research about ant society or ant culture, if we might give it those words. So one of the leading myrmecologists working today, still alive in his 90s now, is Edward O. Wilson, who is a really important thinker for environmentalism. His early career was all based on ants, and he writes this great essay, Karl Marx Was Right, Socialism Works, which is about ant communities. And this is what he writes here. Not only do many ant colonies, exchange food with fanatic dedication, but in the colonies of many ant species, the workers regurgitate food back and forth at an extraordinarily high rate. Now we understand that the result of this is that at any given time, all the workers have roughly the same food content in their stomach. Amazing, a paradigm of like a communist society. It is a sort of social stomach, so that an ant is informed of the status of a colony by the content of its own stomach. What I like to say is that Karl Marx was right. Socialism works. It's just that he had the wrong species. Why doesn't it work in humans? Because we have reproductive independence and we get maximum Darwinian fitness by looking after our own survival and having our own offspring. So 2 points about E.O. Wilson's writing here. First of all is the scientific basis for Kropotkin's argument that ants do, in a weirdly kind of literal way, have a kind of communist society. The downside, if you're approaching it from the left, like Kropotkin is that the point that Wilson makes here is that this is facilitated by a particular kind of anatomy that is specific to ants and not present in humans. This might be open to debate, but the idea is that humans have reproductive independence, a different kind of sexual selection, which facilitates a different model of social, communitarian, cultural interaction. We can talk more about that in class. And before anyone gets too excited about ants as being the kind of paradigmatic example par excellence of socialism in the animal world, Darwin's writing does contain some far darker ant politics. The Formica, Polyergens refusans, is absolutely dependent on its slaves. Without their aid, the species would certainly become extinct in a single year. The males and fertile females do no work of any kind, and the parasites they are, and the workers or sterile females, though most energetic and courageous in capturing slaves, do no other work. They are incapable of making their own nests or of feeding their own larvae. When the old nest is found inconvenient, they have to migrate. It is the slaves which determine the migration and actually carry their masters in their jaws. So utterly helpless are the masters that when Huber, another researcher, shut up 30 of them without a slave, with plenty of the food which they liked best, and with their larvae and pupae to stimulate them to work, they did nothing. They could not even feed themselves, and many perished of hunger. So on the one hand, ants, rather than embodying this socialist utopia that Kropotkin and Wilson might have us believe, they have rather a sinister regime going on here that actually does support a Marxist argument as well, that the people at the top of the kind of social food chain, as it were, are kind of idle pariahs getting rich on the labour of the proletariat. So we might ponder ants more in relation to Marx later. So that's Kropotkin in a nutshell. Moving on to eugenics. So here's a poster from the States in the 20s and 30s, I can't remember the exact source, that defines eugenics for us. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. This tree of flowering human civilization, which draws on other trees. There's a tree of life in Darwin's Origin of Species, and a tree of life, of course, in Genesis and Paradise Lost. So a lot of kind of the cultural politics of trees as a way of modelling data, but that's by the by. Anyway, in a nutshell, eugenics is the science which deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage. So it's about improvement, making the human race better. And that's what eugenics means, kind of good birth. And this is one way of adapting or appropriating Darwin's findings for a particular kind of rather sinister human ideology. The context for this in the late 19th century is the idea that evolution need not necessarily keep developing humanity upwards to a kind of glorious evolutionary future that's implicit in some of the terms that Darwin uses in The Descent of Man about human progress, for example. So Edward Ray Lancaster, another interpreter of Darwin's, writes, we're as likely to degenerate as to progress. And those of you who are doing LIT115 will be reading Jekyll and Hyde, which is a great example of degeneration theory in action in the late Victorian imagination. This fear related largely to urbanisation and concerns about public health, that humanity is actually regressing. We're moving back to our kind of simian ancestors. A Hungarian thinker, Max Nordau, formulates this in perhaps the most influential account of this kind of worldview, Degeneration, from 1895, when he writes as follows. When under any kind of noxious influence an organism becomes debilitated, its successors will not resemble the healthy, normal type of species with capacities for development, but will form a new subspecies, which, like all the others, possesses the capacity for transmitting to its offspring in a continuously increasing degree its peculiarities, these being morbid deviations from the normal form, gaps in development, malformations and infirmities. So there becomes this great social, political anxiety about what to do about the future of the human race, how to address this terrifying prospect of becoming ape-like again. And this is what Galton tries to work out, and in doing this he becomes a really influential figure in what we would now call big data, a kind of mass statistics. So he develops this science of the human, developing a study of human bodies that enables you to work out who the fittest are. And so this is called anthropometry. So we have this anthropometric laboratory in the late 19th century, where he gathers this enormous amount of data about human bodies that enables him to create this theory of eugenics, how to ensure the improvement of the human race. So just looking online about this, I don't know much about statistics, but I was intrigued by the seemingly momentous role that Galton plays in statistics. You know, as it's now practiced now, we're surrounded by statistics, aren't we? By kind of data audit cultures. A lot of it dates back to eugenics. So Galton was able to place his researches about heredity on a scientific basis by applying novel statistical concepts, and can justly be claimed as one of the first social scientists, if not the first. This would pave the way for the development of statistics as a discipline through Galton's follower Karl Pearson. And there's an essay I was looking at yesterday online from the journal Nature from 1885, where Galton describes his statistical method, anthropometric percentiles it's called. I'll post it on Null. And I was intrigued by the language he uses to describe this, but there's a particular kind of aesthetics to these tables and graphs as well. I send the following table partly to exemplify what I trust will be a convenient development of a statistical method that I've long advocated, partly for its intrinsic value, whatever that may be, will at all events interest those of the 9,337 persons measured in my anthropometric laboratory at the late International Health Exhibition who may wish to discover their rank among the rest. So you could go along to this health exhibition in London and get yourself surveyed, the length of your arms measured, your cranium measured, various other things, and then you'd be able to understand where you are situated amongst the fittest. Are you better than others? Are you worse than others? Should you be allowed to reproduce or not? Which is the ultimate implication of this theory. Because the implications of eugenics are, of course, genocide. If we want to improve the human race, and of course I'm speaking this under erasure, then we need to understand who are the fittest, who are the least fit. The least fit must be prevented from breeding. And this, of course, leads in Nazi Germany to the sterilization of particular groups of the population, for example, and not just in Nazi Germany as well. I mean, the British Empire did its fair share of that kind of nightmarish violence. And one example of this comes from an early-ish text for this kind of thinking, Winwood Reade's Savage Africa. And this is the end of this very long text, which is about the extinction of black people. Africa shall be redeemed. Her children shall perform this mighty work. Her morasses shall be drained. Her deserts shall be watered by canals. Her forests shall be reduced to firewood. Her children shall do all this, so working for the British imperial project. In this imperial task, they may possibly become exterminated. We must learn to look on this result with composure. It illustrates the beneficent law of nature that the weak must be devoured by the strong. And this happens not just with regard to Africa, but also with regard to what we now call First Nations in Canada, elsewhere in Australia, this idea that colonialism is justified as a beneficent law of nature, that the weak must be devoured by the strong. And he ends with this rather poetic flourish. But a grateful posterity will cherish their memories when the Cockneys of Timbuktu have their tea gardens in the oasis of the Sahara, when hotels and guidebooks are established as the sources of the Nile, when it becomes fashionable to go yachting on the lakes of the Great Plateau, when noblemen building seats in Central Africa will have their elephant parks and their hippopotami waters, young ladies of the camp stools under palm trees will read with tears the last of the Negroes, and the Niger will become as romantic a river as the Rhine. So you might want to think about this kind of rhetoric, how there's kind of literary style that is used to expound on the terrifying politics of Reade's early eugenic discourse here.
Okay, I'm going to follow on Galton's work, specifically Galton, whose work obviously is associated with the emergence and codification of social statistics, as John has already said, the notion of the so-called average man. This is actually something that we can also look at in relation to Marx, who in his works often talks about this category of the ordinary worker. And Galton is associated with the biologization of class relations. And And all of this comes out of fears, middle class fears, I should say, about, on the one hand, the declining middle class birth rate, and on the other hand, fears of a growing pool of degenerate urban poor. And in a way, we can think of that labouring poor in relation to Marx as well, who shows us in Capital Volume 1 that capitalism depends on the exploitation of a sort of growing pool of urban poor that need to be kept in a condition of more or less abject poverty. But all of this makes us think of Foucault's work on biopolitics, which we've mentioned already in the podcast for week 1, and society must be defended. So I'll just read this out first and then we can unpack that. Unlike discipline, which is addressed to bodies, the new non-disciplinary power is applied not to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being. Ultimately, if you like, to man as species. To be more specific, I would say that discipline tries to rule a multiplicity of men to the extent that their multiplicity can and must be dissolved into individual bodies that can be kept under surveillance, trained, used, and, if need be, punished. And that the new technology that is being established is addressed to a multiplicity of men, not to the extent that they are nothing more than their individual bodies, but to the extent that they form, on the contrary, a global mass that is affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on. After the anatomopolitics of the human body established in the course of the 18th century, we have, at the end of that century, the emergence of something that is no longer an anatomopolitics of the human body, but what I would call a biopolitics of the human race. Foucault develops his theory of biopolitics in a lecture that he delivers on the 17th of March 1976 at the Collège de France in Paris. And what he's saying there is that the society of sovereignty, something that he sees as existing in the 18th century, shifts to a new society of biopolitical regime where the focus is no longer on not only on the individual body, which can be trained and improved, and we have that Galtonian rhetoric there, but on man as a species, on populations as a whole, and what is being targeted is sort of birth rate, death rate, etc., to try and figure out ways in order to improve the conditions for life of a particular population. Usually this functions at the expense of someone or other folk who are considered to be less valuable. Foucault argues in society must be defended that what underpins all of this, and we've seen that very clearly in relation to Galton's work, is that what underpins this politics is racism. In order for me to live, the other must die. In fact, there's a recent scholar called Achille Mbembe who argues in an article from 2012 called Necropolitics, actually from 2003, it's much older than I thought. Achille Mbembe, he argues in that article, Necropolitics, that Foucault's concept of biopower is no longer adequate to describe the way that politics operates today. And he calls it, as I said, necropolitics, so that politics is entirely the work of death. Right, so this is just a sort of digest of what Foucault describes on the one hand as disciplinary power, an older form of power that is still in operation but has been subsumed or updated, upgraded, and sort of incorporated into what he calls biopolitics. Disciplinary power focuses on the individual body. So again, it's also to kind of start thinking that the individual is a social construct. This individual power needs to be modulated and manipulated, trained to be made useful, to be functioning perfectly as a docile body, which doesn't cause any trouble for the state. And to recap that this kind of disciplinary power is a political anatomy of detail. So it's about investigating and analysing in order to manipulate and update and upgrade minute details of your performance in daily life. Biopolitics, as Foucault said in the quotation earlier, deals with the population as a whole, with this new body, a multiple body, a body with so many heads. And it focuses precisely on this population as a political problem. So it's not that disciplinary power, that which is focused on the individual body, disappears, but it becomes integrated into this new biopolitical, or to refer to Nkili Mbembe's term, necropolitical politics. So for the workshop task, we would like you to research the idea of biopolitics and make connections to this week's readings. The Society Must Be Defended is in the library, and if I remember to do it, I have scanned the lecture from the 17th of March 1976, and I'll put that up on Mole for people to look at. It is extraordinary, and in a way I'm quite jealous that you get to read it for the first time. It is really, really extraordinary work. So hopefully I'll remember to do that. And the other workshop task is we would like you to imagine yourself in a situation in which you're talking to someone who hasn't read either of Kropotkin's or Galton's responses to Darwin, and to prepare a short summary of how you would explain their thought. So imagine yourself in a pub, God knows what, having a discussion about Kropotkin or Galton. Okay, thanks very much, and see you next week.
See you later.